Tier list. We haven't done one of these in a while. And what better moment, what better timing to start going back at one of these things right before the release of a new patch. Yes, it's a minor patch. We are getting the new time rifts and the mega dungeon coming in, but we have a whole bunch of balance tuning coming for multiple specs. There is 3 different reworks to different specs also coming out, so there are some things changing, and some players start getting excited. They start thinking about playing something else because they are getting a bit bored, a bit tired of the specs they have been playing up to now. So a new patch is always the right time to start thinking about playing something else. That's also the reason why we are making this video, because it's true for me as well. With this patch coming out, I have started to think about which of these specs would be nice to be playing. So with that in mind, we're going to be doing the same thing here as well. Now, we are taking into account not just how the specs are right now, how nice, how powerful they are right now, and how they are looking for this upcoming patch, but also, of course, what is going to change for them in the patch. There is of course not too much point in saying, oh, don't play this spec because this spec right now is F tier, if that spec is also receiving a big rework in the upcoming patch, right? With that in mind, for today we are starting with the melee DPS and how are they doing right now. If you were interested in playing some of these melee DPS specs, the situation for the melee DPS is like this at the moment in general. As per Subcreation's own tier list, you have specs you have seen before at these levels for Mythic Plus. For example, Subtlety, Retribution, Fury, Enhancement, and Havoc are amongst the most broad and most popular of the specs in Mythic Plus. And then you have other specs not nearly as popular, like Survival, Feral, Arms, Unholy, Assassination Rogue, all towards the bottom. You do at the very least have some changes when it comes to raiding, because now specs that were previously at the bottom in Mythic Plus, like for example Arms Warrior or even Unholy Death Knight, become significantly better in the raid. You still have the same specs that were doing well before in Mythic Plus also doing fine in the raid, because you see specs like Subtlety, Enhancement, Ret, and Havoc still doing very well, and unfortunately the other specs that were doing badly in Mythic Plus, like Assassination, Outlaw, Frost, Feral, and Survival, are still also at the bottom in the raid. Now, these are still more or less the recommendations you would hear when interested in looking at what melee DPS specs to play for the next patch, maybe with the next season in mind. For now, these seems to be the better ones. Basically, the ones that can be good at both, like Havoc, Ret, Enhancement, Arms, and Subtlety, and then maybe if you have a focus on raiding, you can also go and look into Unholy. However, what about what 10.1.5 is going to bring for any of these specs? Like, can we expect something to be changing for some of these specs with the patch coming? The first in line in terms of changes is Feral. Feral right now is quite low on the priority of specs doing well for the melee DPS. They are receiving a good amount of changes in 10.1.5, although a whole bunch of them have to do with the change to mana to all of the hybrid specs. Now all of the hybrid specs will have 250,000 mana, just like healers. But beyond that, the actual changes to the actual, rotation and specs are not that many for Feral, and also not that many to make them become significantly better. They are buffs. Sure, the spec still is getting buffed, and Tank fucking Lord are getting buffed, because if their current situation needed anything was a buff, so at least they're getting buffed, but not nearly enough to be made any more relevant than what they are. So I'm afraid Feral will stay more or less in the same situation they are right now, even after this patch is out. Now, talking about being afraid of certain specs being exactly where they are right now, we have Windwalker Monk. So Windwalker Monk, we covered a couple of days ago, received a 3% damage increase compensation buff, and in 10.1.5 they are also receiving a 2% damage increase compensation buff. So the TLDR is that this is not really going to be changing their situation of being mediocre in the raid and mediocre in Mythic Plus. So if you were hoping for any massive changes, any sweeping changes to, for example, the scaling of Windwalker Monk, empowering their god-awful single target perhaps, none of that is happening in 10.1.5, so you shouldn't carry too much hope on Windwalker either. If you were ever interested in rolling a Windwalker for this next patch, that's not very recommended. Now, talking about being recommended, after Windwalker Monk we have Retribution Paladin. Now, much like the other hybrid specs, they also get their mana region and mana pool changes, but besides the mana changes, they don't really get too much. It looks like a long list, but actually, effectively, it's mostly just more compensation buffs to the spec itself because of the nerfs to the Onyx Amulet, and that's just about it. However, unlike Windwalker, Retribution was already doing fine. They were already a good enough spec by average, so even if they don't receive any major changes, if you wanted to hop on the flavor of the month train about 3 months too late, you can still do it. You can still go and hop on Ret and play Ret. Ret is doing fine in the raid and still doing fine in Mythic Plus. So this new patch, 10.1.5, won't really weaken Ret Paladin and unlikely will make it drop in value until the start of the next season. So it's still just fine if you wanted to go over and play a Ret Paladin. Personally, I wouldn't recommend it because the chances that a niche hipster spec like Ret stays meta, stays relevant for 2 seasons in a row, I don't buy it. I think that Season 3 will put Ret back in line to where they are used to be, and where they used to be is called F tier. So I wouldn't put too much faith in Ret remaining relevant, but at the moment at least it's doing fine even without patch changes coming in a couple of weeks. After Ret, we have the saddest point of the video because we have to talk about rogues. So this is Rogue, and the entirety of the changes to Rogue are a 9% damage increase to Outlaw to all abilities and a 4% damage increase to Subtlety to all abilities. Now, we have already pointed out how embarrassing this is multiple times when the 2 Rogue specs being buffed are also the 2 ones that are doing better than Assassination, which is perma at the bottom basically every time. Now, Outlaw has also been doing kind of just as bad recently, but at the very least they started out being somewhat better. Now, as a rogue, you only have one option. Generally, you only have the Subtlety option in both activities. Even as we look at Mythic Plus, when you look at all of the keys, you still have Subtlety as the clear winner. As soon as you get into the 20 level, Subtlety is an even bigger part of the players, even more so than Outlaw, and Assassination starts almost disappearing. I can barely even look at it. And then once you go into the highest level of keys, it's just sub-rogues everywhere. So yes, if you were trying to push for high keys maybe, or you were tired of being one of these specs, for example, or one of these specs, and you wanted to try to see for once how it feels like to be a powerful spec in the meta for Mythic Plus, go on, you can still roll a rogue to play Subtlety. However, their state is still quite poor. All 3 specs don't play particularly well. Many rogues lament the fact that things like Subtlety or even Assassination have been dumbed down to be more simple and less engaging than previous iterations of the builds, and then now, even worse, it's only Subtlety that has the numbers to back up the performance that they have compared to both Assassination and Outlaw at the moment doing quite badly. So the suggestion would be, you can still play Rogue. Generally speaking, they will find a way to stay relevant. They will find a way to stay meta, even more so now in the raid when you need a single Rogue for the atrophic poison debuff on the enemies. So even more of a guaranteed spot in the raid now. So yeah, it's still a safe pick in terms of meta, but the state of the specs right now is quite sad. It's quite disappointing. I wouldn't personally go and put my stocks into playing a rogue right now. At least until we see the actual note, the actual announcement from Blizzard that they have come up with the reworks that they promised was coming to rogues and is still missing. That's the thing for rogues. After Rogue, we have Enhancement. Now, Enhancement is actually getting a decent amount of changes. Once more, we have the old changes to their mana costs and their mana pool, whatever. What matters more is the second part of the changes to Enhancement. The point they wanted to look at was the fact that they wanted to lower the power of the tier sets, for example, for enhancement, as well as lowering the AoE damage used by Chain Lightning from their tier effect to not also be used in single target, but the compensation buff was to make their single target abilities stronger. So now you have your Storm Strike dealing 20% more damage, Lava Lash deals 20% more damage, Ice Strike deals 20% more damage, and then your tier set bonuses are being nerfed. Overall, this is better for the gameplay, it's better for the flow of the spec to actually have your main abilities do more of your damage. So that is overall a good change for enhancement. Enhancement is still living a reasonably chill life, as I said, even here, for example, in very high keys, and even here, as you can see in the top keys, there are still a whole bunch of Enhancement Shamans. Enhancement Shaman is, at the moment, one of the 4 most brought specs in the highest level of keys, and even in the general level of keys, it's still doing fine. In the raid, it remains a reasonably popular spec, as you can see here, roughly middle of the pack. Their performance is not that excellent, to be fair, neither was Red Paladins, and yet they are still also super popular. So their state right now is fine. The changes in 10.1.5 are not going to make them that much weaker, if not for just adjusting their tier set power. So it's still nice to be going for enhancement. Again, enhancement is somewhat on a niche spot. It's not generally, we don't generally think of enhancement as one of the super popular specs, but recently, especially since the introduction of Wind Fury Totem, they have made it up to be a rather stable type of spec. So I would be okay, I would be more safe with the idea of rolling an Enhancement Shaman for the future patch. Now, after Enhancement, we have the last of the melee group, which is Warriors. So Warriors right now are in a pretty significant divide, where in Mythic Plus, it's basically just Fury that is the pick. You know, in Mythic Plus, in the general key level, it's still, 4 times more Fury Warriors than Arms Warriors, and then once you go into the very high key levels, it's even more than that. Fury Warriors are definitely more prevalent than Arms. Now, once you go into the raid, you do see that despite Arms being still quite lower than Fury, it's barely half. There is barely double the amount of Fury Warriors than there is Arms, and also their performance is actually somewhat even. If anything, Arms is slightly ahead. So it's interesting to see what is Blizzard planning for these 2 specs, because right now they are somewhat close, just the tiniest of buffs maybe in the patch might bring one of the specs above the other. So it's going to be interesting to see what this patch brings for nothing. It brings nothing for Warriors. So Arms and Fury are going to be doing exactly the same as they have been doing up to now. So expect, if you wanted to play a Warrior, to be going for kind of both. You kind of have the choice in the raid for both Arms and Fury, but then, once you get into Mythic Plus, it's likely that you will have to default more towards playing Fury rather than Arms. And Warrior was our last class, which I left for last, with the first class we usually go for, which is Death Knight. The reason why Death Knight has been left for last is because they receive the same treatment as Warrior, since Death Knight is also going to be getting nothing for both Unholy and Frost. Now, both of these specs are in the same but worse situation as Warriors, in the sense that when it comes to the raid, there is a massive, disparity between Unholy and Frost, and Unholy is just doing overall better than Frost, and when it comes to Mythic Plus, they are more close to each other, but that's because they are bad. They're not close to each other because they are both, competitive. It's mostly the opposite. They are not really doing too well. So again, you might have expected something to happen in 10.1.5 for both of these specs. Nothing is happening. Same goes for another spec we leave for last because it's missing Havoc. Havoc also has absolutely no changes coming in 10.1.5. Obviously, I doubt many Havoc players are going to be crying about this, because Havoc at the moment is one of the better ones in both the Raid and Mythic Plus. Of course, you can still wonder what better means when at the moment Havoc is one of the worst performing specs in the Raid. So, where do we judge being better? Do we judge it because it's the 5th most played spec? Do we judge it because at the end of the day, raids are going to be needing a Demon Hunter debuff, and if there are no Vengeance tanks in the raid, there must be a Havoc Demon Hunter? but it is definitely still very, very popular. Even in the very high keys of Mythic Plus, even when you dial it down a little bit, they are still a popular spec, so not receiving changes in this patch for Havoc is not nearly as bad as a Frost DK, an Unholy DK, or an Nerfs Warrior not receiving changes in this patch. At the end of this entire recap, once we go back and look at the situation of the specs right now, we can gauge that 10.1.5 is actually not really going to be changing anything for specs, at least when it comes to the melee DPS. Melee DPS are definitely much more light in the amount of changes they are receiving. As mentioned, Unholy and Frost DK get no changes, Havoc is getting no changes, both of the warrior specs are getting no changes, Survival is getting no changes, basically all three of the rogue specs are not really gonna get changed, Windwalker Monk is also not really gonna get changed, so mostly we can expect with this patch launching in a couple of weeks for most of the status quo of the melee DPS to not be changing in the near future. If you were thinking about playing certain DPS specs in melee in the near future, you can still just look at the current situation, the current power of specs in this patch, and just follow that, because not much is changing. So that's the point for today as to how melee DPS specs are doing right now and how they might be doing once 10.1.5 patch launches with all of the changes coming. So with this out of the way, for today on this Tuesday, we are going to leave each other. We are thanking, of course, as usual, all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help to the growth of the channel. You can still support in plenty of free ways, like liking and commenting down below on this video, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Those are plenty helpful ways still. With this out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, I was expecting more drastic changes for the melee. This is kind of disappointing, actually.